Hey, guess who already tried to film this video? And guess whose phone just stopped recording after like 20 minutes? Yep, that's me. So let's do it again, but this time on my shit quality laptop camera, because I at least trust that one a bit more. This video might be a bit shorter, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to put up with doing all that again. So, hi, I'm Zed. I'm 18 years old, I'm a software developer, and I am a woman. And that's really weird for me to say, still kind of hard for me to say, because for 4.5 years I identified as transgender, as a trans man for the most part. And that was, basically the central pillar of my identity as a person. So it's been a bit of a wild ride to get where I am now. And I just wanted to share my story of how I transitioned and how I detransitioned, because I know that seeing videos and posts and things by other detrans women on the internet has been really, what's the word? Not calming, but like revitalizing. It's been good, and it makes me feel like there are other people in the world. I'm sitting in bed, by the way. It makes me feel like there are actually like other people in the world who might understand, who do understand what I've been going through. And I hope that I can help with that for someone else, because I know I was a kid that was hurt and I went through a lot. And if I could ease the pain of even one person who's been through what I've been going through, then that's enough. So I'll start at the beginning again, even though I recorded this whole thing. I'm not going to get over that. When I was a kid, my parents didn't force me into gender that much. They didn't force me to be feminine. They didn't make me wear dresses. I was a classic tomboy. I grew up like the stereotype trans kid. I never liked girly stereotype things like Barbies and dolls and makeup. And I did like all the boy things, like building things and wrestling and climbing up hills. But one thing that was causing me a lot of issues as a child was that I always wanted to play with the boys, right? Because I was a massive tomboy. I wanted to wrestle with the boys. And so I'd be playing with a boy and it would be fine. But as soon as other guys would come along, it would be like, oh, no, ooh, you're gross, you're a girl, we don't want to hang out with you, right? And that was a main point where I realized that I was not being treated like boys were, or as I thought for a long time, like the other boys were. Also, the older I got, basically, the fewer female friends I had. I had a few in like the first few years of primary school. As I got older, I just lost those friends and only made male friends. So for quite a few years, until like about a year ago, I just had no female friends at all. So in my last year of high school, no, not high school, in my last year of primary school, I cut my hair because during my whole life, people had always looked at me and been like, are you a girl or a boy? And mysteriously, around the last year of primary school, people stopped asking me that, and I was not happy about it, and I had no idea why. So I mysteriously felt this urge to cut all my hair off and go short. And I did, and then I felt amazing about it afterwards, even though in hindsight it was a shit haircut. Then once I started high school the next year, that was when I started having actually dysphoric experiences. The first memory I have that I've actually labeled as dysphoria was a time when I was standing in the hallway with some friends, sort of, and I was wearing a t-shirt, and I wasn't wearing a bra because I hadn't hit puberty yet, and I just sort of realized I felt naked. Even though I was wearing clothes, I felt like my body was on display. Even though it wasn't a particularly feminine body, I felt like it was somehow there for the boys, there for men. So yeah, that was my first dysphoric experience, and it only got worse. So when I started high school, I really, really wanted to do physics. That was like my main goal in life, because my high school was one of the best in our country, in New Zealand, for physics. So I really wanted to get into that. We did a lot of competitions and like international physics competitions and stuff. It's super cool. I really wanted to do physics, and my like homeroom, I guess, teacher was a physics teacher. And one day a student came in and who did a presentation for the physics problem that they'd been working on over the last while, and this person was a trans boy. And I saw this person, and I saw someone who was doing what I dreamed of doing, and I saw someone who looked what I wished I looked like, and I saw someone who was free of femininity, and I thought, holy crap, like that's who I want to be. Then I joined the junior prem debating team, and coincidentally, although not at my high school has the highest rates of like trans-identified students in might be the world, definitely New Zealand though. You know where I went now. But coincidentally, both of the other people in my team were trans. There was a trans boy and a trans girl, and they asked me for my pronouns. And for the first time in my life, after this experience and seeing that trans boy in physics, I was like, wait, you can choose not to be a girl? And then I was like, yeah, like no shit, I'm not a girl, because I'd never been treated like a girl. I mean, I'd been ostracized by boys for being a girl, but I'd been ostracized by girls for not being girly enough, I guess. And I felt like, society had no place for me as a masculine female. And then I found this way that it was okay to be female and to be masculine. And I thought, like, this is my path to freedom, right? So pretty soon I started identifying as agender, and I went to the school's queer club every week, and I never talked to anyone. I'd just sit there and say my pronouns when we went round in the circle. And slowly over the next few months, my pronouns changed from she, her, to she or they, to they, them, to they or he, to he or they, to he, him only. And that was my transition from agender to a full-on trans boy. Another thing that was going on at this time was that I realized that the people who I was friends with in this first year of high school were not actually my friends. Mostly they just did not want me around, and I didn't particularly like being around them either. Water. So, yeah. I'll mention that once I move forwards in time, but now I'm going to stick with that year. So in that year, one other important development was that I became an anti-feminist. And it lasted for quite a while. It's not something that I am ashamed of. Not particularly. I mean, I was wrong, obviously, but I can still understand why I believed what I did, and I can sort of empathize with my younger self. And for me, that also played a lot into the whole trans identification thing, because I felt like if I accepted feminist principles, then I was accepting that there was an oppression of women that could have affected me. And if I was acknowledging that, then I was acknowledging that being female was like a material condition in my life, which I just didn't want to acknowledge. I wanted to be like a man, plain and simple. And B, it meant that some of those things could be affecting me. Some of those factors of women's oppression, that is, could be affecting me subconsciously in a way that would cause me to identify as trans or as male or whatever. So that's when that started. So now we can move forwards in time a bit to the end of that year. So I realized these people weren't my friends, and that was a bit of a hard hitter, but not too bad. On the last day of the year, we went on a year 9 trip to the beach, and it just happened to be the beach that was right by where my childhood friend lived, who I hadn't seen in a couple of years. So I decided in the morning before I showed up, I would go say hi to this guy. And then I said hi to him again at the end of the day, and then we talked on Skype every day for the next year. And I discovered the hard way that relationships don't have to be romantic in order to be abusive. So I started being friends with this person, and we became very, very close very, very quickly, and I stopped all contact with anyone else. And at this point, the holidays began, and I had no contact except with this person. And also, partly because of that, but I think partly just happenstance and maybe genetic predisposition, I started falling into a deep depression. So by the time it came to the next year, I was incredibly depressed. I would go to school every morning because my dad would get angry if I didn't. But I would sit there every day with my head on my desk and never do any work. I just felt like I physically couldn't lift my head up because I was just in so much mental pain all the time. I started having panic attacks, like really bad ones, where I was, crying, hyperventilating, and sobbing for an hour. Put it this way, I was so depressed that it was more than once that I went over a month without showering. So yeah, that wasn't a particularly fun time. And as my depression got worse, so did my dysphoria. So yeah, it's kind of difficult to explain, I guess, how it feels to have dysphoria to someone who's never had it. But I just felt so wrapped up. I felt so trapped in my own body. And I just felt like something was deeply, inexplicably wrong And the things that I felt were wrong were the things that marked me as female, because I was at this time fixating so much on being seen as male. Like every morning it would take me ages to get dressed. Actually, that's not true. It wouldn't take me ages to get dressed every morning, because I never got dressed, because I never took my clothes off, because I was so busy fixating on my body and how much I hated it. So that was shit. So by the end of that year, I cut out that person from my life. Yes, I'm still proud of myself for doing that. Haven't seen him since. And I got into my first physics competition overseas, which really lifted my mood, even though it was really stressful. And then over the next school holidays, over the next summer, I started recovering from that depressive episode. I didn't recover like fully back to normal, happy person, but I got better enough that I no longer felt like killing myself every day. Then the next year, I met someone who was not a negative influence on my life, and who is still not to this day, because we are best friends. The problem for me was that this person was not an anti-feminist. And at this point, that was still a pretty big thing for me. It wasn't definitely not as central to my identity as I am a man, but it was still a pretty core part of who I saw myself as. So this person didn't realize for a while that I was anti-feminist, and that I was, sort of getting further and further right, and I didn't believe in sexism or racism or any of that. But eventually that caused some difficulty in our relationship, which will come up again soon, I promise. But I should probably add in one thing. During this time, my depression was a lot better, but my dysphoria wasn't. I was still obsessing over my body and my appearance, and my hips, and does my chest look flat in this shirt? I was just so fixated every single day, and I think it's because of this, or at least in large part due to this, that at the end of that year I developed an eating disorder, which although the dysphoria has gotten a lot better recently, that is still with me. But I think for me, I can't really separate the eating disorder from the dysphoria, because they stem from the same sort of feelings. Because the dysphoria is focused on, the fact that my body is marked as female, and the fact is, one of the main things that makes you read as female is your fat distribution, right? The shape of your overall body. And I sort of realised, if I don't have any fat, then I won't have any curves, and no, I'm female. And that's kind of where that started from. So yeah, that went on like that for a while. But now comes the part where I start escaping from trans identification and starting to recover from dysphoria. So while I was friends with this person, my life was a lot better than it was beforehand. Not just because of this person, but I was a lot less depressed. I was doing more things. I was doing physics. I was enjoying my life, sort of. And I didn't have the time anymore to sit there and watch anti-feminist videos all day, every day. And after a few months of this, I sort of realised I wasn't an anti-feminist anymore. That was really weird. But what it did do was it opened up the opportunity, because I'd been de-radicalized from the right as well as from anti-feminism, it opened up the opportunity for me to grab hold of the left and head over to that side instead, which is where I still hang out to this day, by the way. And that was partly out of, like, it was partly just because, as I said before, like, I didn't have time to sit there giving myself anti-feminist propaganda every day, and also because meeting this person had, I guess, even though we didn't talk about it often, it sort of challenged me that, you know, I was talking to a rational person, not a crazy, like, feminist and they didn't agree with me, and that made me question my beliefs about feminists as a whole, and that sort of gave me the entry point to, well, I guess the exit point. So I got out of anti-feminism, got out of the right wing, and got into the left wing. And pretty quickly, within a few months, became a radical leftist. So that was a pretty intense fucking few months, going like all the way over there. But there were at that point two main factors that were influencing my eventual detransition. One was that I realized that although my politics had changed so much, my politics had become radical, but my views on gender hadn't changed at all since my anti-feminist days. And I realized that my views on gender were liberal and individualistic, which might not sound like a bad thing to you if you're not a leftist, in which case, whatever, I'm not trying to convince you right now. I realized my views on gender were liberal, and that wasn't in line with my ideology, because I believe that liberalism is harmful and won't address the problems that we face. And the other factor affecting my changing view on gender was my eating disorder, and before this point I'd always been a pretty staunch transmedicalist. I was sure dysphoria was like baked into your brain, and the only way to cure it was by transitioning, and I was just born with dysphoria. But then once I developed an eating disorder, I realized that it's a very similar feeling. It comes from the same part of the brain. And that was really uncomfortable to realize. I thought, you know, I was always the first proponent of saying, like, well, if you know, you're not really trans if you just have body dysmorphia. It's very different from dysphoria. Then I ended up getting both. And I was like, fuck, this is the same thing. And that just, like, totally shook up my worldview. So because of that, I stopped being able to justify my transmedicalist beliefs. So then, because I still had my really strong male identification, I became like a super gender theory sort of person. I went back to being non-binary. I was mutoir for a bit. Never told anyone, though. I was just happy living as a trans man at that point. Well, I wasn't happy, but like that was how I felt I was supposed to be. And I remember right before peaking, I guess, I was trying to figure out, like, what kind of non-binary people are allowed to call themselves gay when they're attracted to what kinds of other non-binary people. And eventually, because of those two things, the eating disorder and, you know, the fact that I just couldn't justify this particular ideology within my larger political viewpoint, I stopped believing in gender stuff. That was scary as fuck. And then, what was even scarier was that I looked up the radical feminist perspective. That was absolutely terrifying. The first person I ran into was someone who was a bit harsh, and that scared me away for like a month or two. And I realized that eventually, after reading radical feminist literature and after discovering other detransition women and their stories, I realized that my dysphoria, well, my dysphoria wasn't, I can't say for sure, but I think my dysphoria wasn't baked into my brain. I think it was caused by the trauma of being raised female. And everyone reacts to that in different ways. Some people, go hyper feminine in order to avoid the scorn and ostracization that comes from being gender non-conforming. I went hyper masculine and tried to escape from femininity entirely. And another factor was that I realized that transition wasn't helping. Because the further I was transitioning, the worse my dysphoria was getting. I'd started testosterone, which I totally neglected to mention before. I started about 2 days after my 16th birthday, on the 9th of October. And then 2 days after that, I was in the hospital for self-harm, which was another thing I didn't mention. That also happened in 2016, my second year of high school. That's when that started. But like you can see the correlation, right? I got really depressed as my dysphoria got worse. I started testosterone and my self-harm got worse. Like all of these steps I was taking towards transitioning were actually, I felt like they were making me better. Like in the short term, these little things would make me euphoric, but in the long term, it was just getting worse. So I discovered the radical feminist perspective. I realized that transition wasn't fucking working. And eventually I realized that I couldn't justify identifying as a man anymore. And that was fucking terrifying. And I decided to detransition. But what that means for me doesn't mean I go back to being feminine, back to being a woman. I mean, the fact is, I always was a woman. Well, I was a girl before, but I've always been female. Even when I was sure I was a man, I never was. But still accepting that fact was very difficult, and it's still difficult now. Just because of so much time I spent just drilling it into my head that being seen as female is the worst possible thing that can happen to you. You're not a woman. You could never be one. Yeah. And so that was early last year, about a year ago. Just when I was starting university in my first year. And it's been an adventure since. Because the odd thing is my appearance hasn't changed at all, pretty much. I've stopped taking testosterone. I still have like a bit of a remainder of the voice. I think it's gone up though, which I don't know how I feel about. I do kind of like my voice more than my old voice. But like for me, detransition isn't about going back to anything. It's about accepting what's already there. It doesn't mean I have to wear pretty skirts and dresses. It doesn't mean I have to learn how to wear makeup. It means that I can be whoever the fuck I am and still be a woman. And that's hard, especially when, like, within society, I mean, being a woman at all is hard, and being a gender non-conforming woman is, like, horrible. Honestly, I hate it sometimes, because I just don't. Maybe I'll make a whole video on it because I just don't know how to explain it to someone who's, gender conforming. And yeah, that's basically where I am now. I want to admit, I guess, that I do still struggle with dysphoria. Not to the extent I used to, thank God, but it's still something that happens in my life. Same with the eating disorder and the self-harm. Relatively, the dysphoria is much less of an issue now. I've weaned myself off of binding. I can now wear a bra or no bra, like whatever I like. But I still have dysphoria to some extent. And sometimes I still want to transition because I get sucked back into those cyclical thought patterns of like, oh, it would be so much like I could just be a man. I can see myself in my head like being a white male, like just, you know how much easier it would be to be a white male developer than like a weird lesbian, you know? And in some ways it would be so much easier. And it wouldn't be hard to go back and say, hey, I want to go back on testosterone. But the thing that's keeping me going, that's keeping me detransitioning, is that when I was a kid, I never saw a butch woman. I never saw a woman who I could ever imagine myself being. And maybe if I had, then I wouldn't have had to go down the path that I've gone down. Maybe being female wouldn't be a source of so much pain for me. And because I never saw a woman like that, I feel like I could be that woman for someone else, for a little girl that was like I was. And if even one person sees me and goes, oh, you know, I could be like her, and then grows up to become a beautiful butch, like, that's enough to make it all worth it, because I don't want anyone else to have to go down this path, because it doesn't work, it sucks, it's shit, and, you know, it would be so much better if it was possible to exist as a woman and just be in your natural state and not perform hyperfemininity. And yeah, I want to help the girls that are coming after me, because no one ever did that for me. So that's why I'm detransitioning. Also for myself. Also because I know it didn't help. And just like with other mental illnesses and other mental issues, the more you sit there and ruminate and focus on all your problems and do what your mental illness tells you to do, the worse it gets. So hard as it fucking is, you have to challenge your thoughts. I will make a video about how you challenge your dysphoria, how you reduce it. I have been successful in reducing my dysphoria a significant amount. And yeah, that's my story with transition and detransition. There's actually a lot more that I didn't go into, but that's for a later date. I wish you all the best, unless I don't. I mostly do though. I think most people are pretty chill. Goodbye. Senebti.